Okay, well, just nod with your heads. Are you hearing me? Okay, so good evening from Israel, everyone. I know we have participants from various time zones, so good morning and good afternoon too. Welcome to those of you who are on Zoom and those of you who are watching us on Facebook Live. It's great to have you all here for our fourth webinar in a series of webinars that we have been holding jointly with our dear partners, the Konrad Adenauer Foundation in Israel. And I'd like to thank here our friends, Alexander Brakel, who is leading the foundation in Israel, and Palina Kedem for this great partnership on various aspects of fighting hate during the COVID-19 pandemic and some related issues. I'd like to hand it over now to Dr. Alexander Brakel, head of the Israel office of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, to say a couple of words. Alexander, please.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thanks to you and the Anti-Defamation League for this wonderful partnership, which we started planning when we didn't know that COVID was coming, but unfortunately we already knew that hatred was spreading. So we wanted to do something together, and I'm very pleased that we kept our plans even under the dire circumstance that global pandemic forced us to adapt to. Today is not only already the fourth event in our series of events, but it's the first English-speaking event, so it's something new, and I'm really delighted that this gives us the opportunity to reach outside the Israeli boundaries and the boundaries of the Hebrew-speaking community, which I think is especially important for today's topic, because everybody in Europe should be interested in a thriving and very vivid Jewish community and its safe future. Therefore, I'm very happy that we've managed to bring together a very impressive range of distinguished speakers who will enlighten our knowledge about Jewish life in Europe today and share their vision for the upcoming future. I'm really looking forward to our meeting and wish us all a very informative evening.
So thank you very much, Alexander. Today, our webinar aims to provide a look ahead to the Jewish communities in Europe. We, as ADL, have been working with the Jewish communities in Europe for decades, mainly through our Europe department at the International Affairs Division. And it is an honor for me to thank our European Affairs Director, Andrew Strulovich, for his extensive help in putting together this webinar. As an organization fighting anti-Semitism and all kinds of hate and promoting values of acceptance and respect wherever we operate, the Jewish communities are a natural partner for us. It's clear that global trends as well as trends in the Jewish world affect those communities and in many times create meaningful changes in many aspects. Today, we will try to examine the current situation and see, based on that, what the future looks like. We have with us today a great panel representing various communities in Europe, as well as a variety of professional lands. Happy to introduce Jonathan Boyd, Executive Director of the Institute for Jewish Policy Research, JPR in the UK. Robert Ejnes, Executive Director of the CRIF, Conseil Représentatif des Institutions Juives de France, a French Jewish umbrella organization. Bini Gutman, President of the European Union of Jewish Students, EUJS, who is based in Vienna. And last but not least, our own Dalia Greenfeld, Assistant Director of European Affairs at ADL, and Dalia is based in Berlin. We will start with a couple of minutes of a presentation by Jonathan Boyd, who will provide us with a demographic and trend analysis of Jewish communities in Europe. Jonathan, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen so that people can see it. Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Alexander. Thank you, ADL. Thank you to the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for this opportunity. It's really appreciated. Let me jump straight in and share this slide, which is from our recent report about Jews in Europe at the turn of the millennium. What it shows is the proportion of Jews in the world living in Europe at various different stages over the course of the last 140 years. And the proportion of Jews in Europe is shown in the blue segments. And you can see over time, the blue segments get smaller and smaller and smaller. And actually, just to cut a long story short, 140 years ago in 1880, about 9 in 10 of all Jews in the world lived in Europe, broadly understood. Today, 2020, about 9 in 10 of Jews around the world live somewhere other than Europe. We see this picture of decline happening very clearly. Why has that happened? Well, I think everyone probably knows the story, but very briefly, reason number one was a wave of migration from Eastern Europe at the end of the 19th, early 20th century, most of which went to America, so the parallel growth of the American Jewish population. Second reason, of course, is the Shoah, which saw over half of European Jewry murdered. The third reason is persecution of Jews in the Soviet Union and indeed of other minorities, which led to, over time, a widespread diminishing of Jewish identity. Reason number four is migration of European Jews to Israel after 48, again after 67, and again, perhaps most significantly after 1990 and the collapse of communism and the parallel growth of the Israeli Jewish population. And the fifth reason I would add is a purely demographic one, which is when migration happens, it tends to be younger people rather than older people who migrate, which means that the population left behind tends to have an older age profile than it had previously. And an old age profile essentially points to demographic decline. So all of those things have fueled that story that we've seen over the course of the last century and a half or so, which takes us to this position now. These are the population counts for Jews in various different countries across Europe. The largest Jewish communities in France, and the UK is relatively close behind. Russia and Germany both have over 100,000. But actually, when we look across Europe, we see lots of very small communities, a couple around 50,000, a few around 30,000, a few between 10 and 20,000, but quite a lot below 10,000 people. So very, very small populations. And of course, when we compare them to the size of the Jewish population in Israel and America in the blue box, you can see even France is relatively small, indeed a lot smaller. So a lot of different populations of varying different sizes, but largely the overall picture is small populations. But as demographers, we're less interested, I think, in necessarily the simple size of a population, and more interested in how those populations break down in terms of their age composition. Because when we look at the age composition of a population, it tells us an awful lot about what's likely to happen in the future. And in demography, we tend to talk about 4 different types of age compositions: a traditional type, transitional type, aging type, terminal type. And just to explain these graphs very simply, if you focus on the 2 blue segments in each bars, the darker shade of blue on the left and the lighter shade of blue on the right. The darker shade relates to people aged 0 to 14, i.e. children, and the lighter shade relates to older people aged 65 plus. And if you look at the traditional type, you can see many more children than older people. If you look at the transitional type, you can see a few more children than older people, but rather similar segments. If we look at the aging type, you can see more 65 plus people than children. And if you look at the terminal type, you can see a lot more older people than younger people. What does all of that mean? A traditional type, when you see that age structure, population is going to grow quite rapidly. Transitional type is a sign of a population that will stay largely stable, might grow a little bit, might decline a little bit, but largely stable. An aging type is a population that, under all normal circumstances, should decline, albeit fairly slowly. And when you see the terminal picture, you're looking at a population that should decline actually fairly quickly in that situation. Now, if we were to look at the Jewish population of Europe as a whole, we would see kind of an aging type picture, a population that, based on its age composition alone, we would expect to slowly decline. But the point I want to stress is that we can look at Europe as a whole, but actually it's really important to look at the detail. So, for example, when we look at Russia and Germany today as a whole, we can see that these are populations that should, by all normal processes, decline. If we look at Poland and Hungary today, these are populations that should decline, albeit at a much slower rate. If we look at Austria today, or indeed at the UK, or at Belgium, or indeed at Switzerland, we see much more of a transitional type populations that should remain stable might even grow. And if we focus in, for example, on the Jews in Stamford Hill in London or in Antwerp in Belgium, we actually see this traditional type structure, because those are Haredi populations with high fertility levels, populations that will grow. So depending upon where we look, we can see in Europe signs of populations that will decline rapidly, populations that will decline slowly, populations that are stable, populations that are growing slowly, populations that are growing rapidly. And there really is this patchwork picture when you look at the detail. And that's some of the demographic detail, but if we focus on some of the issues, we see a similar patchwork picture that I think is very important to stress. So these are data that we gathered for the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights survey a couple of years ago that looked at Jewish people's perceptions and experiences of anti-Semitism. And here the question is to Jews of these various different countries in Europe, to what extent do you think anti-Semitism is a problem in your country? And in France, 2/3 of Jews said they think anti-Semitism is a very big problem, but a look at the bottom, in Denmark it was just 14%, and there are all sorts of shades in between. So depending on where you look, there are very different perceptions of the scale of anti-Semitism as a problem, and this is just one example when we look at anti-Semitism. When we look at migration, also very different picture. These are Aliyah data for the three largest Jewish communities in Western Europe: France in blue, the UK in red, Germany in purple. These are just counts, how many Jews left each of these countries and made Aliyah from 1995 up to today. And if you focus on the red and purple lines, the UK and Germany, you can see that basically over that period, the numbers are fairly low and they are pretty stable. Compare that to France, and you'd expect the numbers generally to be higher in France because it's a larger population anyway. But one of the things we can see that's most striking is this dramatic spike in 2013, 14, 15, 16, which is very much related, of course, to a wave of really devastating attacks on Jewish targets in France from Islamist extremists. But again, there's this patchwork picture. In certain countries, we see evidence of high levels of migration. In other countries, very, very stable picture. Depending on where you look, different stories, different places. And actually, even when we look at Jewish people's experience of COVID, and here I'm really focusing on data from March to May of this year, so during the first wave of the pandemic, these are mortality data from various different countries, most of which are in Europe, some of which are outside. And they're comparing the number of deaths from all causes in March to May 2020 with with the number of deaths in March to May 2019, 18, 17, 16. And if there hadn't been a pandemic, you'd expect everyone to be more or less at 1.0. You'd expect the ratio to be 1-to-1. There would be no difference, particularly in 2020. But actually what we see, for example, in Manchester is mortality rates were 3 times as high as we'd expect them to be normally. In Stockholm and Brussels and Scotland and Milan and London, they were twice as high. But then go to the bottom of the graph and you can see in Rome and in Vienna, they were actually lower than they have been in previous years. So again, we see even in something like COVID and in Jewish people's experience of mortality during the first wave, this patchwork picture, very different experiences depending upon where we look. So, there's a huge amount in the report that we published recently about demographic data, but I guess if I had to highlight one key point about when people think about European Jewry is it's very easy to think about European Jewry as a whole, but there are all sorts of distinctions when you look at the national picture, when you look at the urban picture, when we look at the local picture. And it's very important, I think, when thinking about the future prospects of Jewish communities in Europe, to see that nuance, to see that subtlety, because the story will be different depending upon where we look. I think that's it for the time being. I only had a few minutes, but happy to take questions as we move on.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for this enlightening presentation, eye-opening presentation. I'd like now each of our speakers to provide us with a 4 or 5 minutes perspective on your community. Will the COVID-19 crisis have a long-term effect on your community, on the community structure and makeup? Aliyah, trends of Aliyah to Israel, immigration to other places, effect on stereotypes against Jews and so on. Will the institutions be able to provide the support to the community, or it has the potential to fragment the tight-knit structure and the relationship of the community? So please give us your perspective, and let's start with Robert, please.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you tonight. And looking at the perspective, let me think about where we come from. And before I come to the COVID situation, the French community, Jonathan just said, is the largest Jewish community in Europe, with a size, which I always quote, between 400,000 and a million. And let's remember where we were just 20 years ago. When we're going to think about the next 20 years, let's remember when we were in 2000. Basically, there was no anti-Semitic act. In 1999, we barely had 87 anti-Semitic acts for the whole country for the whole year. And Everett said that in France, the motto, Heureux comme un Juif en France, happy like a Jew in France, was still very adequate. What happened since then? Anti-Semitic acts have multiplied by 9. 12 people have been killed for the only reason they were Jewish in France. And the Aliyah has been more important than ever before, with a peak in 2013, 2015, not to mention the departure of Jews to for other countries. Within France, Jews have had to abandon some of the lost territories of the Republic. And we see an internal aliyah of people moving to the large Jewish centers. And on the political side, radical Islam and Islamic terrorism have been very active. And the phenomenon took 20 years to be recognized and named by political leaders. But at the same time, Jewish life has never been so active and intense. And many new Jewish centers have been built in the neighborhood where it's still comfortable to live a Jewish life. As for the pandemic, the Jewish community was hardly hit at the beginning, especially because it started especially the religious organization, because the pandemic started just around Purim. And we have organized an unprecedented solidarity within the community. However, the synagogues have been closed for Pesach and Shavuot, and we estimate the frequentation for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur to basically 1/3 of the usual numbers. The Jewish community centers have been have had almost no physical activity since March, and Jewish schools were closed for the end of the year last year. They reopened in September. They're still open, and fundraising has dropped in associations or in difficult situations. At the same time, hate and anti-Semitic communication on social media have multiplied, and the complot theory plays a growing role, and the Jews are always on the front row. But all is well. It will be Hanukkah in 2 days, and just to remind us that we've been through other crises before. On the long-term effects, financially, will take time to recover and return to normal, but at the same time, foundations and organizations are on it, and we're planning for the future. In the midst of the pandemic, the French authority have been also started to realize the consequences of radical Islam and Islamic terrorism for our country, and they started a hard fight that still bear consequences for the life and the security of the French population, and for the security of the Jewish population. Also, the fight against hate on social media has reached a high point where all parties, public authorities, associations, civil society, all meet to combat together. So we've good points at the end of the game, and again, this is a Jewish approach, we may end up with good news. Now, as looking at the forecast for 20 years down the road, what are the most important factors? Demographic, what will be the net growth of the Jewish population in France? Immigration, emigration, birth and death, and geographic distribution. Will the Jewish population continue to concentrate on the large Jewish centers? Or on the contrary, will they choose to reinvest some centers that had been very, very famous in the millennium history of French Judaism, but have declined in time. Second is economic and social. The future of Jews always depend on the economic situation of the country. And the French model whether it will be offers sufficient opportunities and social protection for its population, that will count also. Third is politics. Major changes may occur that could have an impact on the future of the Jewish community. Remember that the last presidential election saw the victory of the liberal candidate against the extreme right candidate. And major political issues will be questions that will shape the future of French politics, like social welfare, illegal immigration, Islamic influence, terrorism, and so on. And finally, the future of Jewish organizations will depend on the implication of local Jews and also of the Aliyah of French Jews. In effect, the majority of those making Aliyah belong to the core of the organized community. And the youth Aliyah, which is encouraged by many Zionist youth organizations, have been excellent for Israel, but have deprived the French Jewish community of generations of excellent leaderships. And the Jewish community will have to prove its capacity to innovate and replace the outgoing generation of leaders. Finally, the future will for sure not be a simple continuation of the past, and we need innovation. We need to think the future with creativity. We need to rethink the organization of the community. We need to open up locally with other communities who share our combat, and internationally to learn from best demonstrated practice. We need to invent our future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. And now I'd like to turn to Bini Gutman. Bini, please.
Thank you so much. It's great to be with you. My name is Bini Gutman. I'm the president of the European Union of Jewish Students, and we are the umbrella organization of Jewish student unions in 36 different European countries, and are the democratic and peer-led representation of around 160,000 young Jews. So the community I'm going to speak about today is actually going to be the community of young European Jews. I am personally from Vienna. I theoretically live in Brussels, where UGS is based, although thanks to the pandemic, I spend more time in Vienna at the moment than I do in Brussels. But the community that I feel that I belong to most and that especially that I represent is certainly the community of young European Jews all over the continent. And actually the strength of that community could really be seen in the first months of the pandemic. Because especially in the beginning, it was really young people who took responsibility for their communities, who helped those most in need, and who organized really impressive and inspiring aid efforts all over Europe, helping those most in need, going shopping, buying groceries, but also going to pharmacies and just spending time with people that were alone at that time. And that was one of the most inspiring things that I have seen in these very dark days that we are in right now. I also think that some of the things that UGS does could actually serve as a model for some Jewish communities in Europe. Two of the core values of UGS that we are based on are democracy and peer leadership. So what does that mean? That means on the one hand, of course, that I am elected and that the board of vice presidents of UGS is elected, but it also means more than that. It means that actually the work that we are doing as the voice of Europe's young Jews is based on democratic policies that are adopted by our members. So when we speak about something, when we campaign on something, it is representative of Jewish student unions from all over Europe. And our second core value, peer leadership, I also think is key. Because at UGS, for us, it is young people leading young people. And we think that is key. Because UGS, we really try to empower young people to take on these positions of leadership, to shape their communities. And we can really see quite amazing results with doing that. Coming to less nice topics, the fight against anti-Semitism. In the fight against anti-Semitism, it is very often young Jews who are at the front line of that fight. We have seen in the last few years a quite dangerous rise in anti-Semitism. The same survey that Jonathan talked about before, the FRA survey and perceptions of anti-Semitism among European Jews, also had in addition focused on the experiences of anti-Semitism among young European Jews. And some of these results were actually quite shocking. Among other things, the survey showed that almost half of Europe's young Jews had personally experienced anti-Semitism in the last year before the survey was conducted. This is a significantly higher number than in other age groups, and this is in general a number that should worry us all. In the last year and a half since the survey came out, the situation has only gotten worse. With the rise of the corona pandemic, we have seen a dangerous rise in anti-Semitic conspiracy ideologies that have really gained a foothold all over Europe, with thousands of people across the continent taking to the streets and believing in anti-Semitic conspiracies, which is a very dangerous development that we are trying to fight against. Besides the threat of the growing far right, we also, of course, face a threat, as Robert just talked about, from Islamism, and also from anti-Semitism on parts of the far left that is prevalent on campuses in some parts of Europe. But at the same time, the life of young European Jews is not all about anti-Semitism. I mean, it's not all about the hard life that we are having. And I think that's important to say, and that's also a result of the FRA survey. Because very often, Jewish student unions are actually the only place where many young Jews across Europe that feel disaffiliated from their communities have a connection to Jewish life. It is the only place where they actually experience Jewish life, where they meet with other Jews. And this is, of course, not true for all people. Many people are also heavily involved in their communities before. But for many young people, it is really Jewish student unions that serve as the gateway to Jewish communities, that serve as their point of contact to other Jews. And that is in part, I think, because the leadership of some of the European communities is not representative of the communities that they represent. As in many places, Jewish community leadership in Europe is very often quite old and very male. And that is not necessarily how our communities look like. Young people often get invited to speak on panels, to share their views, but actually not very often to actually decide things. And we think there is a connection there. We think there is a connection between the fact that young people don't always have the power to take decisions, and that is not the case in all communities, but in a lot of communities that is the case, and the fact that some young people are disaffiliated from organized Jewish communities. So we will actually, at UJS, we actually advocate for a change in that. We actually advocate for Jewish communities to have at least one person under 30 on the Jewish community board in a position where they can actually take decisions, where they can shape their community's life, not just on youth issues, but on general issues. Because we think that this is something that is really missing in many communities, and something that would also change communities for the better. Because I think with all the problems that we are having, most importantly, my generation of young Jews is currently trying to reimagine what Jewish life in Europe means. Yes, we are seeing declining Jewish life, and yes, we're seeing a rising threat of anti-Semitism. But at the same time, we also see a lot of vibrant Jewish life, young Jewish life all over the continent. And my generation has very often taken up the position that we need to redefine what it means to be a young Jew in Europe. And because both externally and internally, so both from the outside and within Jewish communities, very often when we talk about Jewish life, it is only done in two frameworks. It's done when we talk about anti-Semitism, and it is done when we talk about the Shoah. And then sometimes also when we talk about the Middle East conflict. Those are the topics that we speak about when we speak about Jewish communities externally, and also very often when we speak internally about ourselves. And for us as young Jews, for many young Jews, we are saying that, of course, these are super important topics that we are dealing with almost every day and work on very hard. But at the same time, those are not the issues of who we are. So we think that we need to redefine the narrative of what it means to be a European Jew, and we need to find a positive foundation to European Jewish identity, because only with doing that, only with including Jewish narratives in a broader European narrative, we can actually ensure that there is a Jewish future in Europe long term.
Thank you so much, Bini. I can really relate to so many of the things that you say, but really the don't talk about us without us paradigm that youngsters in the Jewish communities worldwide take, I think is very important, and having you have a seat at the table is so important. So thank you very much for talking to us about that. I'd like now to turn to Dalia to tell us a bit what's happening in Berlin. Dalia, please.
Thank you, Carol, and thank you, the ADL Israel office and the CAS Israel office, for putting together such an important panel, not only to look in the past, but also in the future and maybe already prepare for it. So I'm based in Berlin. I grew up in the Jewish community in Germany, and I have some insights in the European Jewish communities per my work and also general experiences. So first of all, I think it's important to say that Jewish communities are part of the larger society. That means that all of the general trends that we will see post-COVID also will apply, on average at least, to the Jewish communities. That being said, for many Jewish communities all over Europe, the monetary changes and challenges will be a drastic challenge they have to face. However, Germany, because the Jewish community in Germany is largely state-funded, there are certain contracts, so state contracts for the Jewish community in general, the umbrella organizations, but also on a local level. Because so much is state-funded, we expect less of a challenge in Germany when it comes to these monetary challenges. Jonathan in the beginning showed how the general population will change. And because of the elderly population, we will see some decline in terms of income and revenue within the Jewish communities when it comes to paying your community taxes. And that will be across Europe, but because, as I said, in Germany, it's largely state-funded, it will look a bit different. On a positive note, though, the platforms and all the positive things that have changed during the pandemic, and Bini has touched on that, I think they will have a positive effect in the future as well. For example, the digitalization. So when we look in the Jewish community homes, for example, the elderly homes, now they have iPads and they can talk on Zoom with their friends, and this is something that will continue. And those might be small things for everyone here on Zoom, but for these Jewish elderly homes or hospitals, that was a big change, the whole digitalization effect. And those positive effects, for example, another example I loved was the dance sessions of 60 plus men and women and others in Munich is now also online. So I think those small, but actually not so small changes, because it affects so many daily lives of Jews in Germany and beyond that, those are positive effects on the Jewish community. When it comes to stereotypes, however, we saw also on Jonathan's presentation that in certain communities there were more COVID deaths, and there's all kinds of theories on why that is. And we also saw in this whole COVID area until now, in areas, also in New York City, not in Europe, but that we saw where more Haredi people are part of the community, there's a stereotype, there's a larger stereotypes against Jews in COVID and how Jews are engaging in the masks and all of that. So because Germany doesn't have a Haredi population, this is also something we didn't necessarily see. But I will in a minute also come to the anti-Semitism exactly that we saw in a rise. And lastly, on the Aliyah also that we touched on. So also back to going to the presentation of Jonathan, we saw this little, I think purple line was it, that was always very low since in the 1990s. And I also, I don't have a crystal ball, I can't say necessarily, but I do not see why this Aliyah from Germany would change or would significantly spike up in the next years. However, we have elections next fall in Germany. And if again, the far right would, and there's no indication at the moment that it is the case, but if the far right would have a significant push forward and a higher amount of voters for them, obviously this would be a struggle for the Jewish community, but especially at the moment, it doesn't look this way. So going back to the stereotypes and anti-Semitism, there's really three phases that we saw. One, the first phase was when anti-Semitic expressions, they really took place, particularly in the online sphere, as most of our lives went online. But in the beginning, it was often combined with non-explicitly anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. And these myths, they quickly became very widespread, very known to the public and very easily engaged with. In the second phase, Jewish life in itself went online, right? We all shifted to online events and while Jewish community gathering or Shabbat or whatever it is, but we shifted. And with this shift of Jewish community gathering online, there was also a shift in something we called Zoom bombing. ADL has published many guides and many articles on the Zoom bombing right from the beginning. And this is something that happened to a lot of Jewish communities also in Germany. A lot of anti-Semitic, Heil Hitler greetings, a lot of people trying to invade these Jewish spaces online. So this was really the second phase that we saw. And now in the third phase, where we are at the moment also, is that the anti-Semitic expressions are no longer manifested just online, but now, and we see them in chats and we see them in social media a lot, but now a large number of these demonstrations, so the anti-COVID demonstrations that are happening, or anti-vaccine, anti-COVID measurements, a lot of these movements had these anti-Semitic conspiracy theories in their baseline, in their foundation, are very present. A few of the examples are that the yellow star that we know from the Holocaust, from the Shoah, is now used as an anti-vaccine movement, as a form of oppression, of being oppressed. So when we look at pictures, or even go to these for research purposes, to these demonstrations in Germany, and we just saw it on Sunday in Düsseldorf, we saw it weeks in Munich, in Berlin, in Köln, it doesn't matter where you look. At each and every demonstration, you always see a yellow star as a form of oppression. So Holocaust relativation, a big problem and a big, at the moment, current change is that we see a lot of Holocaust relativation at these demonstrations. And the second one is really anti-Semitism within the movements. So they may not be anti-Semites as a 100% their job title, but within these movements, within these conspiracy theories, there is anti-Semitism in its base and in its ground. And one last report that I want to point at is the last change that I am at the moment see is that these conspiracy theories in general, whether they're explicitly anti-Semitic or not, these conspiracy theories are now in the focus of society. Before, I felt, especially as a Jewish citizen and as a Jewish organization, we spoke a lot about conspiracy theories, right? But a lot of the other organization, even politics and government, were really saying, oh, okay, this is like someone posting something online, no one really cares, right? But this has now changed because of the conspiracy theories being now relevant to all society, right? Everyone at the moment, if someone is not wearing a mask because they don't believe in it, it is a threat if you are in some form of public transportation, by the way. So that being said, there's a difference now how conspiracy theories are a threat to this larger society. And that means also that anti-Semitism within these conspiracy theories is a larger, or there's a larger interest, let's say that. So the last report that I wanted to note is by Amadeo Antonio Foundation, a great partner of ours based in Germany. And they showed, for example, QAnon, a very known conspiracy theory at the moment and a movement. There are few channels where nearly 150,000 people followed these two QAnon channels since April 2020. So from 0 to 150,000 followers, where each message is read 6, or at least opened 6 to 9,000 times. That is a lot of people who get content from these conspiracy theory movements, from QAnon, for example. And that means that there's a large population that every day is consuming these conspiracy theories. Yeah, so that being said, I started a bit with the internal, how the Jewish community would look like. And obviously no one of us has a crystal ball, but some of the trends we will see. We will definitely see some positive outcomes as we now, for example, can gather like this and still go home afterwards, right? In our own homes and have our offices and have these webinars. And this digitalization effect, I think, will largely change Jewish communities, especially for older generations. But then when we look at the external outcomes, anti-Semitism, conspiracy theories, we definitely see a rise and we see a different type and even an interest in these conspiracy theories. And it's not 100% clear yet on how that will influence the post-COVID life and the post-COVID individual, how this will express, how this will manifest, if it's still relevant afterwards. But we definitely see at these demonstrations specifically some of the moments of Holocaust relativation, some of moments of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, and so on.
Thank you so much, Dalia. And now I'd like to gather us all on the screen, just a second. In a minute, I'll add you all on the screen. And okay, so thank you very much all. The Talmud says prophecy was given to the fools, and it's hard to project, but still looking ahead 20 years from today, trying to foresee what will happen. And Bidi, you spoke about, you know, anti-Semitism not necessarily shaping the life of Jewish communities, and that I totally agree, but still there are elements that will really affect the reimagination of the Jewish life in Europe. For example, trends like banning the Shechita and Brit Milah that really affect the ability to live Jewish lives. So please, each of you, what is the one most important factor going forward that will help your community thrive? Let's go for the positive now. Let's start with Robert, please.
The community, the French community is very active, will continue to be, but you're right, it will depend on politics, as I said, economics, politics, social. But politics is very important, whether, as you just said, we will be able to continue to live a Jewish life in France, which we've done for the past 2,000 years, with good and bad times, but let's hope for good times.
Please, Bini.
Yes, absolutely. And while I don't think that our lives should be shaped by anti-Semitism, of course, there are in some ways. Of course, we are the generation that grew up behind bulletproof glass, that is used to pass armed security guards whenever we enter Jewish institutions, that is used to have our schools look more like prisons than like schools, and have terror alarms that we practice in those schools. So of course it does shape our lives. The point that we are trying to make is that we should have an identity that goes beyond that, an identity that is also based on positive things. And actually that is something that makes me look positive into the future, because the best part of my job, and that may sound corny now, is actually seeing all these great Jewish initiatives that are happening all over Europe. And I would actually like to spend much more time talking about them in public settings than I have to do about anti-Semitism. But unfortunately, the reality and the world that we are living in is as it is. And of course, rising anti-Semitism is a huge problem. But I actually think that these are two problems that interact with each other and that play a role with each other. Because I think in order to have a better situation in 20 years, we need to change the way European society works more broadly. And we are right now, as the Jewish community in Europe, broadly speaking, of course, the situation is different from country to country, but we are facing a danger from anti-Semitism. We are facing a danger from a rising far right that more and more often is also trying to physically kill us, like in Halle last year. And we are facing a threat from Islamism, which is also trying to kill us, like in France quite often in the last few years, and like in my city of Vienna a month ago. And that is very clear. And these two ideologies, fascism and Islamism, actually have a lot in common. These are two ideologies that are based on hatred of the other, on hatred of modernity, on misogyny and anti-Semitism. And actually, I think that the answer to that actually needs to be then to build a counter model, to build a society that is based on solidarity, a society that is based on working with each other, and it's a society that is based on openness, on an inclusion of narratives from Jews, from migrants, and from others, because this is actually the best answer. And this is a European society where Jews can thrive in 20 years. So I think that has to be our goal long term.
I totally agree with you. And I think that COVID really triggered the thinking of we're all in it together. And in this respect, really creates these partnerships beyond the Jewish community with other communities. Jonathan, please, your perspective on what will help your community thrive.
So I guess I'm changing roles slightly, less as a demographer, more as a representative of the British Jewish community. Look, I think I look at the British Jewish community over the course of the last generation or so and see an incredibly vibrant and dynamic community that's been very creative in terms of its educational and cultural programming. And actually even on anti-Semitism, I think the way the community handled the whole Corbyn crisis was pretty remarkable. Came together and actually sort of combated it very, very strongly and very coherently. So you know, it's the British Jewish community, I think, is strong and vibrant and dynamic. But as others have said, I think, you know, looking ahead, there are all sorts of questions and there are all sorts of unknowns, and I'm sort of always a little wary of making projections. But you know, politically, Britain has always been quite stable. That's been shaken a little bit recently. Economically, it's for most of my life, I'm 51. I just remember Britain as economically pretty stable. That's also being shaken the moment with Brexit and with COVID. There are all sorts of kind of bigger global challenges like climate change and like, you know, AI, which could have all sorts of impacts on employment rates. All of those things kind of can really upset the apple cart and create all sorts of instabilities. And essentially, I think depending on political and economic stability in Britain and elsewhere, so Jewish life will follow, and it will be impacted by that. I think what's positive about the Jewish community in Britain and elsewhere is that they're pretty strong communities. They are well-educated communities. They are economically solid communities. We can see in some of the data that we've done and research on COVID that actually, certainly in the first 6 months or so of the pandemic, the Jewish community was not particularly impacted economically because people are relatively strong economically. But you know, politics and economics have all sorts of impacts on people's lives. So it's important, I think, to track what's happening politically, to track what's happening economically, and indeed to track what's happening demographically, because those things will shape the future. Who knows exactly what they will bring, but they're important things to monitor.
Yes, thank you very much, Jonathan. Reminds me of a panel I was part of a couple of months ago in the beginning of the first wave, talking about the day after COVID. I think back in the days where we thought that COVID was a sort of, a very quick episode in our lives, which is probably not, but talking about really looking at Jewish communities from, about anti-Semitism. And there was a lot of concern about economic crisis that usually over history led to a lot of anti-Semitism. So we will see what's going to happen. Dalia, to you, please, on that question, this positive question.
And the unmute button. So I think there are two pillars. On the one hand, it's a communal, and on the other hand, it's a political pillar. On the communal hands, I want to point to what Bini already said, starting from this kind of triangle where Jewish life is happening: Shoah, anti-Semitism today, in the future, and in the past, and a bit of the Middle East conflict. And one of the changes that we do see is that from the younger generation, but also now spreading into the other generations, there's a kind of a cry, not a cry, but there's a general need for looking into Jewish diversity and looking in Jewish life beyond this triangle. And it doesn't mean not looking into anti-Semitism, but there's a need within the Jewish community, and also specifically in Germany, to not just be seen as the Jew and just talk about anti-Semitism. That being said, for example, there's a report by the Berlin Senate that looks into the intersectionality of Jewish people and what it means to be an intersectional Jewish person, whether that's a person of color and Jewish or a woman and Jewish and so on. And this report was the first one that really looked into the general experiences for being Jewish and also with other marginalized groups or just in general, a person of civil society. And there was so much interest in this report relating to all of the other reports that are coming out all the time, that it shows that there's a general need for that. And I do think on a communal level, there's a need for this pluralistic views of Jewish life. And that means within the Jewish community. So for example, in the UK, Jonathan already said the thriving of Jewish community life, there's a commission within the Board of Deputies to look into, for specifically after George Floyd, and POC people, so people of color and BPOC people, so looking into internal racism within the Jewish community, but also what can be done. And I think these kinds of commissions and these kinds of changes within the Jewish community life will have definitely a say in how our Jewish communities will look like in 20 years, because we focus, or not focus, but we have different conversations. And once we have different conversations that we had the last 10, 15, 20, 30 years, there will be some form of change. But also, when it comes to the media, there's now a need for representation. So on the one hand, for many years, especially in Germany, anti-Semitism was a topic, but a lot of, even in journalism and government, didn't believe that there is actually more anti-Semitism and rising numbers. So now that this has been manifested, it's clear, but with RIAS and other institutions that report on these incidents, now that that's clear that there is anti-Semitism and there's even a rise in certain areas, now there's also a demand for this representation of diversity of Jewish life. So that's on the communal level, a change that we will see, and also a change that will, I think, gain attraction in general government and policy. Now, that being said, when it comes to the political pillar, I think one amazing challenge that we faced and now are going to next phase is structure. when I think 10, 15 years ago, I didn't have a place to report anti-Semitism to. I could go to the police, but which teenager goes to the police and reports anti-Semitism, or not even teenager, but who does that? Even though we should. But now there is a specific structure looking into the numbers of how many anti-Semitism commissioners, not only on a local level in Germany, on a national level in Germany, in the EU, and so on, the European countries, we have a lot of anti-Semitism commissioners. That is a person in an office connecting to this topic. That's one. Looking into the IRA definition is another one. So there's a working definition of anti-Semitism that now is the question how it is implemented, for example. And this structure of having a political understanding of what anti-Semitism means for the judiciary, for law enforcement, and working on these structural opportunities, that means, I believe, at least my assumption, and I don't have a crystal ball again, but my assumption is that in 20 years, if we continue this path of building a structure to fight anti-Semitism, I believe then we stand a much better chance to fight anti-Semitism because of the structure that we're building as civil society, as governments. And then the next step, and I think that is a very important step, is combining our efforts. So different organizations work together on combating anti-Semitism, and this combination of really working together, and this is something that ADL is doing, I believe, very well on the ground, is combining these specific efforts of other organizations saying, great, you're doing already this kind of workshop. Now let us move into this space with you together. I think this is something that we, as specifically as Jewish communal organizations, have to look into. What can we do to have a better space for Jewish life in 20 years in Europe, but also beyond. So definitely these two pillars I see as opportunities to have a better stance in 20 years.
Thank you so much, Dalia. And now I received already a couple of questions. So I'd like to now to open the floor for a couple of questions. We have a little bit of time from the audience. Please, whomever wants to ask a question, so raise your hand, and if not, use the chat, or I will read the questions that I already received. Any question from the audience? Let me just see. I think that, let me read one of the questions. So one was already answered, but the question that I just received, Reform and conservative Jews in Europe, how are they received? This is a question that we deal with a lot from an American Jewish lens, less so in Europe. Who would like to answer this question? Dalia, Bini, Jonathan, Robert? Please, Bini.
Yeah, so this is actually a super important question that is actually also quite a hot topic in Europe. Because in most European Jewish communities, the default is Orthodox. I mean, of course, in the big Jewish communities, that is different. In the UK, this is very different. In communities like France, this is also different. But especially in most smaller Jewish communities, there is only Orthodox Jewish life, or almost only Orthodox Jewish life. And there's maybe a tiny conservative or reform congregation there. But this is the default in Europe. At the same time, most people in those communities, or a lot of the people in those communities, are not actually that religious. Most of those people are secular. So there's a lot of people that identify as Orthodox, but are Orthodox but secular, which is something I think very peculiar about Jewish life in Europe. At the same time, we at EOGS try to change that a little bit. At EOGS, each year we organize something called Summer U. Actually, I have to take it back. We have organized it for 37 years in a row until the summer, where it first didn't happen because of the Corona pandemic. But besides, in times of pandemic, we organize called Summer U, which is our flagship event, which is an event that brings together 400 young Jews from all over Europe for a week in summer, for a week of workshops. This is where EOGS Democracy happens. But this is also a place where people can meet and exchange and engage with each other. And at Summer U, we have started recently to have multiple different minyanim for Shabbat, to have an Orthodox minyan, but also a conservative and a reform minyan. And this was for many people that participated in Summer U, the very first time in their lives that they had the ability to choose, that they had the ability to choose to go to an egalitarian minyan, to choose to go to a conservative minyan. I mean, that was actually, I think, an experience for many people going there, especially people from smaller communities, that really changed their perspective on Judaism. because a lot of people didn't feel at home. And like I personally identify as Orthodox, and I feel more at home in an Orthodox setting, although I would like personally to have more egalitarian spaces. But for many people, this is not the case. And many people, that leads to them affiliated from Jewish religious life. So actually, through creating these opportunities and showcasing that you can have these opportunities in Europe, while still also having Orthodox Jewish life, while not taking away anything from the Orthodox Jewish life that has existed in Europe for so long. I think this is key in actually broadening on how we look at Jewish religious life. And if we want to ensure that there is Jewish religious life in the future, we need to broaden these perspectives, and we need to make sure that there is more space for different denominations in Jewish settings, and that we give people the opportunity to choose which denomination to have, and not just have a default that might not be fitting for many people.
Thank you, Bini, for this powerful message. I have one question here for Robert, and in the interest of time, so we'll keep it short. But Robert, how closely are Zionism and support for Israel associated with Judaism in your community? I believe that it's part of this, identifying Jews with the state of Israel automatically. So please give us your perspective on that.
The French Jewish community is very close to Israel because most people have family, a lot of people have also bought apartments in the higher part of the society. And therefore, the relationship between French Judaism and Israel is very strong. Now, talking back about the last question that you asked, the relationship, the differences in the community is not all Jews have the same view on the relationship to Israel. And this is also something we need to live with. And I think it's also an issue for the future, because we used to have a much more monolithic type of Judaism in France, because Napoleon had stated the consistoire, we had a mainstream organization, everybody was on the same wavelength with some broad views, but altogether now we need to reunite everybody, all the Jews, and we need also to reunite the Jews of France with the Jews of Israel. We don't have the same problem as the Americans. The Americans, it's much way apart with the Israelis, and but for us, we also need to make sure as Jewish organizations that we remain connected to Israel. And I think this is essential. As to the way the anti-Semites view us, of course, they make no difference between Jews and Israelis, and they don't understand where we belong, even though some families are in France for centuries, they would say your country in Israel, even political. I'll tell you an anecdote. We were in a meeting with a definite friend, and she is the president of one main organization, and she said, had we known, we would have put your flag, talking of course of the Israeli flag. So this is the type of things that we are identified with the Israelis, but we manage basically to explain, and we need to explain and explain again, that we are Jewish, that we're talking in the Jewish, in the national community as national French Jews, not as Israelis. We need to explain our connections, we need to explain our friendship, but this is quite a challenge that will continue. It's been since the creation of Israel and probably before, but this will continue, and we need, and this is the role of the Jewish organizations to explain things to their counterparts in the French society, to make sure that they, what we live, what we feel is not necessarily understood by the people we talk to. Essentially, in the civil society, in the political sphere, and we need not to make the assumption that everybody knows and feels the way we feel.
Thank you very much, Robert. Thank you to all our speakers. We now have to end, but this is a webinar and an issue that I think triggers so much thinking about Jewish communities in Europe. How will they look like 20 years from today? What are the trends going to be? What are the changes and how COVID affects all of that? So thank you so much, Jonathan, Robert, Dalia, and Bini for providing us with an important perspective. Thank you to all who attended this webinar on Zoom and on Facebook Live. And thank you so much to our partners at the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. Have a good evening, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you.